Welcome to those of you just joining us for our latest in our series of Newman conversations. There's our speaker today, or the conversationalist today, is Maggie Doherty, who is the director of our Art of Dying Well project at St. Mary's. Also, and I think that's where you are today, isn't it, Maggie? Works at the Bishops' Conference in Our Lady of Walsingham room, which is, given that I'm in Norfolk, seems extremely appropriate. She's also a trustee of St. Joseph's Hospice in Hackney and has a particular interest in digital health. And it is said, although this may not be true of people like Jeff Bezos, that only two things in life are certain: taxes and death. Well, Mr. Bezos may be able to avoid taxes, but not even he can avoid death. And as a historian, I spend a lot of my time in the 19th century, where the attitude towards death is very, very different. You can see the most obvious example for any historian is Queen Victoria's letters. The moment Prince Albert dies, she starts writing on, her writing paper has black borders. She goes into her black widow's weeds and actually never comes out of them. Indeed, by the 1880s, Gladstone is complaining that, Albert's been dead for 20 years. Couldn't she just sort of wear something a little brighter? But for the Victorians, death was a constant presence. The biblical saying that in the midst of life there is death was so constant, and in a way, very few families didn't lose a child in childbirth. Death came early, and one of the things that's happened as the 20th century got older, as it were, in the West, and it is a Western phenomenon, it's not a phenomenon elsewhere, is that death became something we didn't talk about. And in a more scientific age, in an age where, in one sense, you could almost say in a country like this, but it's not only this country, the health service almost becomes a sort of substitute for organized religion. It's almost as though one of the things that healthcare does is it so removes the possibility of death that we don't talk about it, which in a way makes it all the more difficult, because the one thing that every living human being on this planet has in common is that she or he will die one day. Unless you're Elijah and you get whirled up in a fiery chariot, or you believe, as I do, in the Assumption of Our Lady, you don't get out of here alive. But as a society, so fixated are we on life, on, if you like, consumerism, that, and I mentioned Jeff Bezos a moment ago, rich men like Jeff Bezos pour an awful lot of money into trying to avoid death. They're not going to be able to. For a long time in this society, we have, particularly in the West, avoided talking about death. It's become professionalized. Undertakers can deal with that. Vicars can deal with that. Priests can deal with that. It's outsourced. One of the things the last 18 months has done is reminded us that death is constant. And actually, we have seen in this society, and it's been, I think, and it's one of the places I want to start in with Maggie. For me, and I lost a very dear aunt who's also my godmother. I mean, she was 95, bless her, and she really she'd lived a good life. She was a wonderful woman, raised her family, active in the church, and died a peaceful death. But one of the saddest things was that at the funeral, because of COVID restrictions, we were very, very limited. And hundreds who might have turned out, we were limited to 30. And in a way, that reminded all of us of the difficulties that we all have emotionally in dealing with death. And actually, Maggie, and this is where I want to start in with you, one of the things that occurred to me, and I was actually I'd been thinking, because we'd kind of been preparing only for a short while. She went ill suddenly. And my sister she was in Manchester, my sister went to the hospital. And my aunt just said to her, "I want to see the chaplain." And it was quite interesting because, again, with COVID restrictions, it was almost as though the nurses thought that the chaplain wasn't necessary. Right. "You'll be all right," they said to her. She doesn't need the chaplain. My aunt insisted on seeing the chaplain. And they let my sister in and the chaplain in. And the chaplain blessed her. And then she left, the chaplain left, and my sister stayed there. And my aunt just slipped away. And what was clear to both of us, knowing my aunt as well as we did, that she wasn't going to go until she had been blessed. And that struck me as a sharp contrast with the tragic death of the MP, David Amis, where the police, again, rather in the way the hospital had been with my aunt, in this case, of course, tragically, reluctant to let a priest in, as though, what does religion have to do with death? So there are two examples: sudden death in one case, unexpected death, a death where both people sought solace in their religion. One got it, one didn't. What do you think, Maggie, this pandemic and the way in which death has become more in our face in this society in the last 18 months, what do you think that your project, The Art of Dying Well, what can that teach us about how to prepare all of us for what inevitably comes to us?
Well, John, thank you for really taking us through a wonderful history of death and dying, and thank you for everybody for being here this lunchtime, for giving up your time to listen, to help us really all prepare for a good death. There were so many interesting points there, John, in terms of when you spoke of Queen Victoria and wearing black. Well, we have so many people who are walking around having been bereaved by the pandemic, and nobody knows. And a word of consolation, how are you doing? Is there anything I could do for you? Might be helpful. And some have spoken about the possibility of wearing a black ribbon, because we really don't know. We don't know unless we know somebody, and we don't know unless they've spoken of their bereavement, because there is a tsunamis of grief. There is a tsunami of people walking around who need to have their hands held, and to be held with full of compassion. And as an aside, St Mary's University, that we have just begun a partnership with Child Bereavement UK to train every new teacher in the art of bereavement, of caring for themselves through bereavement, and of caring for the children in their care, because teachers assistants are at the front line of helping children, and helping children through the pandemic, when some may have experienced the death of an aunt, experienced the death of a grandparent, experienced the death of a parent. And we're not 100% sure, but we think it's the first university to have put on this training. Coming back to death and dying, and opening up the conversation about death and dying, the pandemic has been difficult for us all. It's been particularly difficult for those who have experienced the death of a loved one. And as you said, John, that funerals changed. They changed dramatically. So some saw their friend, their aunt, their grandparent, the funeral online. Others were able to be there. But again, it's, I suppose, in a way that we're all to be conscious of picking up those pieces, of going along to speak to somebody who has been bereaved in our parish, as somebody that we see when we go out to the shops, or our next door neighbour, because the carrying of that not opportunity to meet together, to say farewell, and also to really mark the life of somebody that we loved. When it comes to your beloved aunt and David Amos, the sudden death and the death that was known to come, neither are easy. The finality of death is something we can never come to terms with, that final goodbye. But as Christians, we do have hope that we will be reunited. But with your aunt, isn't it interesting that that she slipped away when the chaplain came, when she received the sacrament of the sick, how important that was to her to hold on, to wait for the chaplain, and how critical the role of a chaplain is in a hospital, and the role of any faith leader in administering to their people at the end of their lives. When it comes to David Amos, you're completely right. And it's his funeral this week, his funeral in Westminster Cathedral, the opportunity to lift his soul up to God and to mark a wonderful life of service. And I know that the Cardinal is working with Cressida Dick to look at the possibilities of looking anew at crime scenes, and the fact of faith leaders being able to get to their parishioners, to their faithful, when they're dying. There's so much to unpack here, but our relationship with death, dying, and bereavement during the pandemic has changed, because we have been faced with our own mortality and the mortality of those that we love in a way that we haven't had to before.
I think so. There seem to me to be two aspects to this, as you say. One is the effect on those who have lost loved ones, but there's also the wider effect on the rest of us, that, as it were, given that, as I said at the start, we've lived, on the whole, most of us in the West, in a society that's consciously avoided talking about death. For the last 18 months and more, you can't hear a news bulletin without hearing about death. And I wonder here, what if, we hear a lot, and quite rightly, about a mental health crisis. And I do wonder, and I don't know whether your work gives you any insights into this, what sort of effect are we seeing that this, having death in our faces all the time, every day, every time we listen to the news, what effect do you think that is having upon mental health for all of us, really?
Well, I think that death, up until the pandemic, was medicalised, and you have some wonderful doctors, such as Dr. Catherine Mannix, who is an advisor to the Art of Dying Well, who have opened up the natural process of dying, which was really needed, because people found themselves at the bedside and not knowing about the breathing patterns, and how the breathing becomes more laboured as somebody is nearing the end. So there are great people that have come to talk about death and to open it up, because we need to face our own mortality to be able to make the most of our life now. In terms of, there is a commission on bereavement post-COVID, because the impacts are huge, and so many of the impacts are as yet unknown. And it's a reminder, really, that we begin with what we can do to help, what we can do in our neighbourhood, in our community, with our friends. The Art of Dying Well, and I noticed that Bridget is on this webinar. Hello, Bridget, because Bridget's very important to this particular project with the St. Vincent de Paul Society, to train 500 of their members to become end-of-life companions who also move into bereavement, who help a family, who help a bereaved person when their loved one dies. And also for any of you here on the webinar who may think this is a particular calling to be an end-of-life companion, then do get in touch, because the SVP training, which has been devised by the Art of Dying Well at St Mary's, is great training and will equip you to be alongside a loved one or a friend at the end. And I know many of you have already done that and done it incredibly well. So it's just an added help, an added resource, if it's something that you would like to do.
Maggie, that's fascinating, and I do hope people will take this up. Can you tell us a little bit about what it means to be a companion, an end-of-life companion?
John, it's a really good question, and really, I suppose it's what it takes to be a good friend. It's do we listen? Do we respect the other? Do we offer help, practical help when it's needed? Do we collaborate with family members and other friends? And in terms of for us, in terms of being driven by our faith, it's that sense of being alongside somebody, because we know that we're helping them on the journey to the shores of eternity, which is a very, very important journey. The end-of-life companions that are receiving this training are looking to where they will use this training, because there are some fantastic programs in hospitals, in hospices, they're beginning in care homes, and obviously in our parishes there's always a need. But for those who are already working in hospitals, they receive further training, like the same with hospices and care homes, because we all need a friend, and we all need to make new friends. And John, I would ask you, what do you think it takes to be a good end-of-life companion?
I think you've done a perfect description of it. There is a sense in which, as you say, it is accompaniment. It's being there. And sometimes just being there can be very difficult. There's a natural tendency, well, maybe it's just me, but I don't think it is just me. There's a natural tendency to want to help, and for that to mean being active. And for me, certainly, one of the things I learned with my aunt, and also years ago when my mother died, is that sometimes you've got just to be. And you've got to be there on their terms, not yours. It's not about, I'm here to help. So what can I do? What can I do? I'm going to try this. I'm going to try that. Maybe it may just be me having a natural tendency to want to help. But actually, one of the things I've learned is that you just being sometimes is enough. Just being there, just holding somebody's hand if necessary, and just letting them know that you care. Because I think one of the things, and it's something that the pandemic, I think, has so intensified, but it was there, but the pandemic has intensified it, is there is a kind of loneliness to so many of our older people. I mean, my aunt was very fortunate in my sister went over there most weeks, and she had some good friends nearby, but almost until the end, she would go and visit other people, some of them younger than she was. She'd go and see people in their late 80s, because she knew, and I learned that from her, as it was, she knew that sometimes just somebody just knowing you're there is enough. But of course, the pandemic made that impossible. You couldn't just go and see somebody. You couldn't just go and hold their hand. And sometimes I've discovered, and I don't know whether your work and the Art of Dying Well would confirm this, but sometimes the most important thing is just being there. And then responding as the person you're with needs a response. And if they don't need you to say anything, don't say anything. Just be. I don't know whether that makes, that makes sense to me, but does it to you from your work?
John, I think that's beautiful. I think it's exactly that, to be, and to be a presence. So it's so the person knows there is somebody else there if they want somebody else to be there. And that can be a comforting presence, it can be a hope-filled presence, it can be any number of presences, but the being with is critical if that person wants to be with another.
It's interesting because very often I think it's difficult to know whether they do want somebody there. And the other example that strikes me is from many years ago. My mother died nearly 40 years ago now. She had a stroke and went into a coma. And therefore we didn't know whether she wanted us there or not. And I've got two brothers and a sister, and so we took it in turns. And because I'd had to come up from Norfolk and they were all local, I did the night shifts, and we sat there with her because we felt she wanted us to be there. And then it was quite peculiar. She had the stroke on the Monday, and then Friday morning, I said to my sister, I'm going to come and have some breakfast with you. She said, but you normally stay, John. I said, yeah, I can't. I don't know why, but I'm going to come. She said, but we'll be leaving her alone. And I said, I have no idea what I'm talking about, but let's go and have breakfast. I'll go and have a shower. We'll come back. So we did that. And literally, as we got back to the hospital, we saw the nurses running in and she'd slipped away. Literally, I'm convinced to this day she'd heard us coming back and she thought, I don't want to die while they're with me. I want to spare them that. And so she did. And to this day, I've no idea why. It was the only time in about 50 hours I left her. But I just had this feeling, and I'm sure it came from her, that no, go away. I really appreciate you've been here, but I'm about to slip away. I just want to do that quietly without you here. But it's so difficult to know that. But that's how I felt. So in that case, I thought we'd done our bit by being there. But she didn't. She wanted privacy right at the very end and just to slip away quietly.
And John, that happens a lot. That it's when somebody goes out of the room that their loved one, in a way, chooses to die then. And and it's really when for some they wrangle with it because they think that they should have been there, but actually I truly do believe it was their loved one's choice to die when they were outside the room. It happens so often.
Does it? That's fascinating. Well, that's in a way that's reassuring to know, because to this day, I mean, my sister was very uncertain, but she felt afterwards. She felt she felt that was what Mum had wanted. The other thing that struck me is the effect on the rest of us during this pandemic and I think we've all become more conscious of death. And you mentioned before the way in which it had become medicalized, which I think is absolutely right and is fascinating, because I think the other thing that this is starting to do, if this isn't too weird a thing to say, it's demystifying death. Because death we're not quite where the Victorians were, obviously, but because it's become more common. Well, you and I are having this conversation now, and as you and I both know, the art of dying well has been going for a bit. But I can't help but think that this is in a way its moment, because it is now such a topic of conversation. And I think in a way this is an opportunity for all of us to demedicalize the thing. And I think in a way, although it's not uncommon to as it were almost mock the Victorians with it, but I actually think the Victorian attitude towards death was more healthy. If you look at Newman, and you look at the work that Newman did as a parish priest in Birmingham, you can see there that death is simply part of the ministry. There was no parish priest anywhere in either the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church who didn't most weeks deal with death. And in that sense, in a society where I think religion was much more common, I think there was a healthier discussion of death. And although we can say, well, it's easy to mock Queen Victoria, but actually, was she really, is there really anything there to mock? She clearly loved Prince Albert, and being there in that way and signalling it. And it's interesting you said about maybe people wearing black armbands now. And we've seen that happen on special occasions. But I do wonder whether in the aftermath of all of this, one of the things that one of the lasting effects of the pandemic might be that we move back towards perhaps a healthier attitude to death. I don't know what you think.
Well, I think you're totally right, John. I think death is part of life, and in a way that we've tried to hide death. And by us having this conversation today, by us being confronted with our own mortality during the pandemic, we would hope that post-pandemic, as we move to a new future, I know we're still living within it at the moment, that healthier relationship with death continues. Because ultimately, if we can face the fact that we are going to die, we are going to live more fully, because we know that our time is finite. So, I mean, some of the biggest regrets at the deathbed are not making enough time for our friends, about working too hard. So that's a common ailment that men have towards the end of life, and not living a life that's true to us. And so it's that sense of, if we can understand now that actually none of us know, and let's get on with it, then it's really going to help us have a healthier society. The other is that there's been a rise, as many of you know, in death cafes, which are great places to have a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, a cake, and to meet new people and to discuss death, dying, and bereavement. And that it's great that there are these proliferation of new ways of engaging. The other is just to give a shout out for the Art of Dying Well podcast, which this month is going to be on men and grief. A really, really, really important topic. And it's going to feature the News at 10 presenter, Julie Etchingham, speaking to a former colleague, Colin Brazier, who they used to work together at Sky News, and now Colin works for GB News. But his wife died about 4 years ago, and he's bringing up five children on his own, so of differing ages, and he's a remarkable man. So you'll hear his story. It's being released next week, and also it's an interview with a Norwich City fanzine chap whose mother died when he was very young, and he says that her death is the fuel in his life, because it determines all the decisions that he makes in life. So it's well worth, please do listen to the next podcast, which will be on the Art of Dying Well website, because there's some great interviews there.
And I think that directs me, Maggie, towards one of the things that when I tell friends that I'll be doing this, one of them, who's a lot of my friends are all the secularists, said, "Oh, what on earth is dying well, and why is it an art?" So I said to them, well, I'm going to ask Maggie this. I said, but just have a think about it a minute. I said, why should, we look constantly in living? You can hardly move on social media without somebody telling you how to live better, and how to improve, 1,001 ways to improve whatever, from scuba diving to hair care for those who've still got it. So you can hardly move in life for how to make it better. So why should the end of life be a place where, we don't worry about that, you just die? Surely there ought to be a place for dying well, and I don't see why. And one of the things I love about the whole project is, we move away from the idea of the medicalization, the science of dying, and I love the idea that dying well is an art. So I'm going to tempt you out along that. So what would you have said to my friend about what on earth does the art of dying well mean? Hope my answer was a decent one.
Well, I think you answered it really, John, that it begins with living well, and it's an art because there's a beauty involved, which there's always a beauty involved in art. But also, I would say, and I'm very conscious that there will be many experts in the room who know far more than I as to what dying well is. But I'd say three things as to how we die well. Firstly, that we reconcile now with those who have aggrieved us and who really we've caused offence to, but that we do it now rather than when it's too late. And if we did get the opportunity to do it and that person has already died, then also we need to forgive ourselves, because we all make mistakes. I would say that also that it's the more we think about death, the more we face death, the more we face that our loved ones are going to die and that we are going to die, the more we can be at peace about it. And I'd also move back to the shores of eternity, because and I know you're talking to your friends who do not yet know God, but it's the fact that for those that do, it's the fact that we're moving to eternity. But going back to what is dying well, it's starting to live life well now when we've still got time.
I think that's really important, because in a way it seems to me that you can do two things with death, given that we're all going to come to it. You can try to forget it's there, and you can sort of focus on everything else, and then just hope that somehow when it arrives, it's not too unpleasant for everybody, but you never know. Well, the other is actually to almost not quite welcome it as a companion, but know that it's there and wonder about, well, how you do live, so that when that moment comes, both for you, those you love, and those who love you, it is easier. And I think it's in that way, if you make it almost a companion, it's one of my favorite poems is Constantine Cavafy's Ithaca. And one of the things that poem does, and if you don't know it, go away and read it. It's one of the most wonderful poems. One of the point right at the end, because of course it's a meditation on Odysseus and his travelling back from the fall of Troy and his long journey. And right at the end of it, Cavafy talks about when you arrive back in Ithaca and you find Ithaca poor, do not worry, do not be concerned, because it was the journey that made you rich. And for me, there's a lesson in that, in our attitude towards death. If that is our Ithaca, and it is our Ithaca for all of us, it is the place we will end up. It's not arriving in the place that matters. It's how you arrive in that place. It's the journey. So if in knowing that is our Ithaca, in knowing that is our destination, and not hiding it from us, don't need to have it in our faces. The news does that for us at the moment, but not hiding from it, not resiling from it, not shunning it, but knowing it's coming. That way, I think, I mean, this is one of the things that struck me about my aunt's death, who she knew at 95, that, but her line was, she talked about it, not obsessively, but she talked about it with us. And she'd said, when it comes, I'm ready. But what that meant was, and if you talk to her, she reflected on, well, it's like this, well, I've been to see my 88-year-old friend. And, she'd done things for other people, and she'd done things for other people because for her, that was about living well. But the interesting thing was, when it came to her dying, somehow that fed into it. It was like, well, I've done this for other people, and I know that when the time comes, even in this pandemic, there'll be somebody there for me. And she went peacefully. And I think in a way, for me, she was she was almost a sort of, that was almost an emblem of how you die well, because what had she done? And as someone said at her funeral, she'd lived well. And I think that there's an awful lot in that. And what you said about forgiveness, I think, is so important, because, nobody, to live is to regret. We've all done things, we've all missed opportunities, we've all fallen below the level we expect from ourselves. But if we can't forgive other people, I've often found the thing that goes with that is you can't forgive yourself either. Our Lord talks about you will be judged with the judgment you give. Well, for me, one of the meanings of that is actually, if I am harsh and unforgiving, well, actually, I'm also harsh and unforgiving about myself. And if I can't forgive, how can I accept forgiveness? And for me, that's where, and it'd be very interesting to talk to people. And as I say, a lot of my friends don't have a religious faith, and get their perspective on this. Imagine how I would cope with it without my religious faith. Because for me, Jesus went there before me. He's the first fruits of the resurrection. And, one of the things, and it's read out in the funeral service for my aunt, but, in the sure and certain hope of the resurrection of the dead. And for me, it's death will come, as it will for all of us. But, what my faith tells me is it's a stage on the journey. It's not the end of the journey. And I think it must be very much harder for those who see it as the end of the journey. And I can see why in a society that doesn't have, or many people don't have a religious faith, why you might try to avoid death. Because actually, if you really do think it's the end, that must be in a way, I almost admire the courage of people who can face it without a religious faith, because I don't know I could. I really don't know that I could. And how do we, how does the art, in terms of the art of dying well, dealing with that? I suppose if one just comes back at well, look, live well. That's a way of saying to those of all faiths and none, faith can help you, but actually you can do an awful lot of work yourself, even without faith. And maybe it might actually be a way of coming to a sort of faith. I don't know what you think. Is there anything in that actually in concentrating on what one does, how one lives, one begins to get a bit of a perspective on what life is about?
I think that's totally true, John, and I think that we have much to learn from people of no faith. And I just thinking during the pandemic that I've got to know my local community and made some great friends, mainly people with dogs, because I love dogs. Just and dogs make great companions, and they're great in terms of end of life companions as well. But so it's in terms of living well and living authentically. The people that I've met, I absolutely love meeting with them on the walk, and I just need to get a dog. But so I think it's the sense of hope is within all of us, but how we express that hope in different ways. We're very blessed to know that there are shores of eternity. But also, I do think that in that unique journey to the shores of eternity, we can learn so much from other travellers. Incidentally, hospices are sometimes known as places for travellers on a unique journey. So that sense of journeying with is critical, is crucial. And I think often it's not by coincidence that we meet fellow pilgrims on the journey.
I think that's really important. I think that it is, and that's one of the things that the pandemic, because it's been so difficult with isolating us, one of the things I think we need to rediscover, and perhaps are because we've been deprived of it, is that sense of companionship. Because I think one of the things, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, that was so hard for so many people was an almost total isolation. I mean, we're not built to be totally isolated. I mean, you know, we are human beings as social animals. And I found, not having a dog, I found if you just walk at the same time as the dog walkers walk, you get much the same effect. And interestingly, because we're all so much more conscious of physical space, people will make space for you, and that again invites a conversation. And I can't tell you the number of totally sporadic, random conversations I've had just as a result of people standing aside with their dog to let me pass. So in a way, we're kind of rediscovering the importance of things we took for granted. I can't resist. I mean, Jacinta Good, one of our listeners, has just a wonderful phrase. She said her parish priest speaks of death as a moment of transformation and not an end. I think that's we shall, Oscar. We shall. I think that's a most wonderful comment from your priest, and I think there's a lot in that. I mean, after all, even if we have no faith, the one thing we can't know in that case is whether death is an end. In one sense, it's an act of faith to believe that death is the end, because we cannot, you know, and those of us blessed with faith, with that gift. You know, we have an assurance, and therefore our faith takes us there. But actually, it's as much an act of faith to believe there's nothing there, because with the exception, we would believe of our Lord, no one has come back to tell us. And in that sense, I think to think about death as just a brutal end, it's rather an interesting aspect of atheism. There's no reason why death should be an end. It can be, and I think that priest talking about it as the moment of transformation, I think that's a wonderful phrase, because actually, whatever it is, it may be a transformation to nothingness. It may be a transformation to the shores of eternity. Faith can tell us there's nothing there. Faith can tell us there is something there. I have to say, I think I know which one I find more reassuring. But, you know, your work with the hospice, Maggie, what sort of insights does that give you in terms of the art of dying well and your own work?
Well, it comes back to living well, John, because for those of you who have had the privilege to enter a hospice, and please do think about it, because hospices have wonderful cafes and they're great places of life, and they're always looking for volunteers. But the set is that life is to be lived. So there's art exhibitions, there's community groups, and also think of one particular story, which was there are many, many beautiful stories. And also hospice isn't just about physical place. You have wonderful, community palliative care teams that are going out to local communities and local neighbourhoods, so that those who have chosen to die at home can die at home. But one of the stories was that a lady was dying, and on the basement of, not the basement, the ground floor of St. Joseph's, there are patio doors. And she really wanted to go outside, but it wasn't possible to physically take her outside or indeed put her in a wheelchair, because it was nearing towards the final hours. So they got the bed downstairs and they took the bed outside so that she could be outside in the beautiful surroundings. And I say that because nothing is impossible in a hospice setting or in the local community with community palliative care teams, that every person on that unique individual journey is treated like a king or queen. And so it should be.
That's so vital. I mean, I think you've encapsulated something really important there about what it means to be there for that person. It's particularly in those final hours, it's about respect. And in showing respect for that other person, you're actually showing respect for yourself and for all of us as human beings. Because if, as we believe, we are all children of God, then actually we all have a unique value. And if the very last service we can do to another person is to make it easier in some way and more comfortable, then I think that good vibration, if you like, spreads. And I think one of the things that's become very clear, certainly to me and obviously to you from what you've been saying, is that for many of us who have been used to sort of commuting, to traveling, and not being fully part of the community in which we live, being forced by the pandemic into one community. One of the things that certainly struck me here where I am is that people have become, particularly once the lockdown ended, people have become more friendly in a whole number of ways. I've certainly noticed there's much more, there's kind of, in funny little ways, in the shops, people have become much more friendly. And they're getting to know each other. And I was very struck at the remembrance service here on Sunday, there's always quite a lot of community organisations that have wreaths. But this year was almost a record number. I think I counted, and this is a small town of about 6,000-7,000. And I think I counted 18 wreaths from local organisations, and so many of them were about bringing people together. And talking with people at after the remembrance service, one got a sense of, it was almost like community organisations had been revived here. And I think that certainly talking to friends elsewhere, I get a similar sense that, as it were, we've rediscovered as people the importance of local communities in a way that perhaps we'd forgotten. But I think that from the point of view of helping us live well is extremely valuable, I think. So Maggie, in terms of the art of dying well, what next for the project?
Well, I've mentioned about the bereavement training for teachers, about the end of life companions. And again, if you would like to take part in that training, please do email me and I'll put you in touch with the SVP coordinator. Please watch out for the Art of Dying Well podcast, the Men in Grief. Also, there are some rich resources on the Art of Dying Well website. Increasingly, when there's the next event, obviously we'll let you know on the St Mary's website. And if research is an area that particularly interests you and you have a spare 5 minutes, do look up our latest publication with the think tank Demos on voices at the end of life, which looks at 110,000 conversations that were happening online about death, dying and bereavement from 2004 to 2020. And to really put it into 3 words, people are searching for comfort, care, and community, which really speaks into all that we've shared today, John.
I think it does. And for me, one of the fascinating things about this project, given where you are at the moment at the Bishops' Conference, but also where else you are, which is St Mary's, that it speaks to our vocation as a Catholic university. I mean, the Cardinal himself has said that, and I think this is part of the art of dying well, it's one of the things it does so well. Sometimes people, and we can all, being fallen human beings, almost anything good can be used for bad things. And we can, so often religion can be presented as a divisive force. But actually for us, as the Cardinal has said, our Catholicism is our point of openness to the rest of the world. And I think it says something rather marvellous about St Mary's, that it's a university community that houses a project that is a serious academic. I mean, anyone who's seen the podcast, has read any of the work of The Art of Dying Well, knows it's a very serious academic enterprise. But it's academic in the best sense of the word because it connects. And I think it says a lot about St. Mary's as a university and our vision of ourselves as a Catholic university. I mean, I may be speaking from ignorance, but I did do a little bit of looking around to see other universities doing this sort of thing, and I didn't find any. So, I mean, one always hesitates to use the word unique, but certainly in this country, I'm not aware of any. And I think it says something about St. Mary's as a community, because we know that when we talk to our students, the word, I think, on any of those word cloud things that you get sometimes from surveys, the word that comes through most clearly from all our students is we are a community. And that means, and I think this is where the art of dying well is so important. We're a community that takes in, I think, an unusually wide variety of students. Mid-60s% of our students come from backgrounds with no experience of going to university before. In terms of race, gender, there's a huge diversity, I think an unusually large diversity for university. But what is, I think, unique in a university, it's not unique to have medical facilities and medical faculties, but in a university, and universities are often seen as places for young people, although of course at St. Mary's, we have young people of all ages. But what I think is different is that we are, as a community, we are quite prepared to say to our students, many of whom are younger, this is where the journey goes. And we want you to be on that journey with us now. We don't want you not to think about it until you get there. You've got relatives. They will probably, if things go the way they tend to go, they'll predecease you. What are you going to do when it gets there? How are you going to avoid having some of those regrets? How are you going to be when that moment comes for you? And I think what you've said today about actually how you're going to be when that moment comes for you is how you have been when that moment come from other people. And I think there's a moving comment here from Kim Salmons, which I can't help but read through, and I shall try not to blub. When my brother was dying of leukemia, I couldn't acknowledge to him that I thought he would die, even though we knew he would. The day before he died, I said my goodbye to him. Now, he might not survive to the next day, but I still couldn't acknowledge it or properly say goodbye because I wouldn't admit that all my hope was gone. I regret this. Do you think others experience it too? Well, I know from talking to my own family, Kim, that you're not alone in that. Certainly, at least two of my brothers, when my mother was basically in her last week of life, they couldn't ever admit that she was going, and so you're not alone in that. And it is very, very difficult because we are built, I think, and society, if you like, socializes us to, I don't know whether you would agree with this, Maggie, but I think society socializes us to avoid admitting that actually it's coming. Because, there's always a pill you can take. There's always something they can inject into you to keep you alive. And it was one of the most difficult things with my mother was, the doctors were persistent in saying, but look, we could keep her on life support. And I had to push them and say, but what's the brainstem activity? And they admitted, well, there wasn't any. And I said, well, why do you want to keep her on life support? And it was as though, so Kim, this is your reflection sparked this. It was as though the doctors themselves couldn't bear to admit that actually her life was coming to an end, because there was something they could do to keep her breathing. But was that life? And that Friday, we were going to have to make a decision. My mother slipping away before we had to make the decision saved us from that. Because my sister, who was fiercely loved her, knew what she should do, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. And I didn't want to argue with her. She didn't want to argue with me. My mother solved the problem by clearing off before we got back. But Kim, you're not alone in that. And I think, Maggie, your work and your experience would confirm that, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I would say, Kim, that love never dies, and we never want to let go of the person that we love. So I completely understand. I didn't think until the breathing patterns were changing with my mum that she was going to die, because we want to deny it, because we can't face living without that person. And it's just a testimony to the beauty of love, but it doesn't make it any easier. But if we never loved, then we would only be shells of people, wouldn't we? But it's death marks us, and the finality and the finality of death mark us, because we hope for the shores of eternity, and we hope to see those that we've loved again. But in the meantime, that love, there's an aching love and an aching gap there.
Faith is, as Hebrews says, faith is the assurance of things we can't see. If we could see it, it wouldn't be faith. But it's the hardest thing of all, because they've gone and we are here, and the thing that hits us as they go is, in this life, in our life here on earth, we won't see them again. But of course, as Christians, we know we will see them, but we know that through faith. And people sometimes say, oh, it must be easy, but actually faith isn't easy. If faith was easy, you wouldn't need to have it. It makes it easier to do the thing that I think Maggie comes away from this, and thank you so much for spending your time with us. I think this has been so useful, because for me, I think the thing that comes through strongly, and I would say to everybody, is that the secret to the art of dying well is actually living well. And that means living for others as well as yourself. And in a materialistic society, sometimes we need reminding of that, perhaps, Maggie.
And John, I was just thinking about the 3 words that sometimes we don't get the chance to say, but say them now. Thank you, I'm sorry, and I love you. And the more that we can get into the habit of saying those 3 words, really, that, yeah.
And how often the most difficult of those words is the middle one, sorry. And of course, if we can forgive and we can be forgiven, it becomes slightly easier to say sorry. Maggie, thank you so much for giving up your time. And I do hope that our listeners and those who watch the podcast after this will be inspired to volunteer, to watch the podcast, but above all, to live well. Maggie, thank you very much. And Marianne, thank you so much for organising this. And we shall look forward to fresh conversations in the future. For now, Maggie, thank you very much indeed. And bye now. Bye.
Thank you.